there's always a way. And I always found and fought for hope with him. And so I just want to be able to share that hope with the world at large.
Thank you so much for joining us here today. Okay, so first question, what mental health condition have you encountered in your life?
In my life, the mental health condition that I've experienced myself is anxiety, and learning about being anxious and anxiety itself in my adult life was very jarring because I didn't know that it could be something that I would deal with ever in my life. I didn't even dive into my own mental health journey until my late 20s. So it was definitely something that as we now are progressing and being able to have these conversations more often, I feel it's so important to do it at a young age. And, what I feel my life could have been like had I even been exposed to the idea or, thinking about how my life could have improved from having some of these tools and resources that we now are seeing in schools and, in programs. That really feels like it would have made a world of a difference. But anxiety, and I've been a caregiver to my youngest brother who dealt with depression and substance abuse. And so, realizing that knowing more about not only my particular mental health condition, but also being aware that there's such a large variety of them, and being, empathetic to those around you and being kind to yourself. I think all of those things are encompassed in your own mental health journey.
I get that one. Anxiety is a close friend of mine. I started experiencing anxiety as a kid, and then it manifested into intrusive thoughts and obsessive thinking. I didn't even realize it was anxiety because, no one just shared that word or explained what that was. But for me, it was like with doing presentations, before tests, before competitions. I was an athlete. I'd get like sick to my stomach, anxious, and I was always biting my nails and picking my skin and obsessing and ruminating. And it wasn't until high school, I think, until I learned about what anxiety was and was like, oh, that's what this is. So I agree with you. Education and awareness is so important, especially at a younger age. Speaking of anxiety, how do you cope with that? Like, what are your best anxiety coping skills?
Currently, my best anxiety coping skills are definitely getting plenty of rest. It's so funny because you think about it as school age children, you've got parents and loved ones telling you, go to sleep, get some rest, you've got kind of that regimen. But as an adult, it's like, hey, no more regimen, no one's on top of you to get that rest. So it's up to you. And especially working within the music industry, it is something that's very common for you to just be in the throes of the passion and enjoy working on the song, or you've got a deadline or some sort of pressure. And so I've had to prioritize myself. And I think prioritizing myself, getting enough sleep, exercising, taking vitamins, I think that has all, been a huge helper within my anxiety. And like you mentioned, the way that it manifested in my later teens, feeling like if I had a presentation or a deadline, that would immediately feel like it would arrest me. And then also feeling nauseous if I had like some type of disagreement with a close friend. Like I finally eventually understood how those things were manifesting in my life.
For sure. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of anxiety, especially in adolescence, with relationships and when you're learning how to communicate and set boundaries and speak up for yourself while, not being defensive. And it's kind of like coming into your own. And I definitely agree. Some certain interpersonal relationships brought up anxiety for me as well. You mentioned you were there for your brother going through depression and addiction issues. So how would you say is the best way or the way that you chose to show up for your brother when it comes to depression and addiction challenges?
Showing up for my brother through his addiction and mental health challenges, especially with the depression, was a work within itself because of the lack of information within the family space. I think that we had never dealt with or really understood that there could be these things. Everything being first generation in the United States was survival. And so we constantly were met with, if there was some hardship growing up, my parents did kind of default to what they knew, which was it's going to be fine. You'll get over it. Everything will be okay. And so when I realized that, seeing my brother go through such hardships in his later teens, going into adulthood and I started to realize that the substance abuse was not casual. It wasn't, it started to appear very frequently. I realized that I couldn't write it off just as like the oldest brother and just say, oh, you got to get over it. Life's going to get better. Everything's okay. I couldn't brush it off any longer. And I felt like being his protector, being his advocate, I thought, how do I understand what he's going through instead of writing him off and diving towards him was really diving towards my own mental health journey. So that's what prompted me to then, start developing into this space.
Thanks for sharing that. So what would you say for anybody else who has a family member who goes through mental health challenges? I can relate to that. I have a few family members that live with mental illness. How would you say is the best way to show up for someone you love while also protecting your own mental health?
Protecting your own mental health while showing up for a loved one that may be facing a mental health challenge is a challenge in and of itself, because you don't know where to draw the line. You love them so much that you're willing to put yourself in the middle of everything. And I think that that's pretty much how I approached it. It was, whether it was a meeting with a doctor or going to see a psychologist, he had actually ended up in the mental health hospital a couple of times, and that was on the back of probably substance abuse, from what I could tell, especially abusing psilocybin and whatnot. So, it was hard because I didn't understand it. I had never used those substances myself, so I didn't know what effect they could have. So first I had to educate myself. I felt like I woke up every day and read a different Quora article or a different, Medium article or psychology, just trying to understand what I was essentially facing, because that was what he was facing. So that helped me understand a lot about, it's no one's fault, and it's not something that he is necessarily choosing, for these behaviors or for these things to happen. So it really brought us closer. And I feel like I dove toward him in the middle of a lot of that turmoil.
So it seems like you're saying just like showing up, being available, but also taking the time to do research to really learn about what they're going through specifically, so you have this awareness and understanding of what they're going through. And that's so important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, like, there's so many misunderstandings about mental health because they'll think like, oh, today is bipolar weather, or I'm so ADHD, I can't focus on anything. And it's like, mental health disorders are not synonyms with personality traits or weather.
Right.
Like, no one would say, oh, I'm so diabetes right now, or, or say like, oh, I look cancerous today. Like, you just don't say stuff like that. And I don't know why when it comes to mental health they do. And I think why people say that is just lack of education and awareness. And the more we talk about it and the more we provide information online, on social media, and through just candid conversations, the more people gain an awareness and respect. I would never say something like, oh, I'm feeling so neurodivergent today if I was feeling antisocial. So it's just that appropriate use of the terms comes hand in hand with like educating ourselves about what these experiences are.
100%.
Yeah.
The stigma stems out of, just not having had experience with it. It's like a fear. And so even when you say, for example, in my household, if somebody were to bring up mental health, you're literally talking about the same way that you would say physical health. But because you said mental health, it's immediately equated with a mental health condition or a mental health illness or a mental illness. So, it's problematic in that sense. But I think the conversation becoming far more, not even casual, I think it's just becoming more every day for us to understand ourselves and one another, and showing that empathy. I think it opens the door, because again, if you have experienced something and you are not diagnosed or you have not seen anyone about it, you don't know what it is. You think just like kind of that survival mechanism. It's like, oh, it's nothing. I must have not gotten enough sleep, or maybe I got to do some more exercise, or maybe I had not enough sugar, etc. So we start blaming it on things that we understand because we haven't been equipped with the information or the tools that we don't understand yet.
For sure. And circling back to sleep, getting a good rest, which can be anywhere from 7 to 9 hours, depending on what you need. It's individual, is so integral for good mental health, and having a healthy sleep hygiene. And that means things like a great bedtime routine, which could mean an hour wind down where you don't watch TV or look at your phone or engage in anything stressful, separate yourself from work, be in low lighting, read, take a bath, journal, whatever it is, anything to do to calm yourself down before bed. And I've read that sleep doctors recommend getting out of bed if you're rolling around and not able to get back to sleep for longer than 15 minutes, it's better to get out of bed and do a mindless activity like reading in low lighting. Do not watch TV, do not get on your phone. And then once you're tired, get back in bed. And also to use your bed just for bed activities like sleeping and anything else that you would do in your bed, but nothing with work or anything that like associates bed with anything stressful. Like don't have serious conversations with your partner in bed. Make bedroom a safe haven. So those are just a few tips for sleep hygiene. So important. Were so helpful for me getting my sleep on track to better my mental health. So going back to anxiety, because I believe this question ties in, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. How does living with anxiety affect your work?
Living with anxiety definitely shows up in my work in the sense of, for example, whether it's, showing up, the Grammys are happening this week. So if I'm invited to certain functions, there's part of me that's excited, but the other part's like, it's a lot of stimulus to take in at once, whether it's the music or a lot of people and like, working in the space that we do. You're kind of expected to, regardless of how you feel, you're almost seen as an extrovert just by default because you're in entertainment, you're involved with creative activities that are, sometimes in a party setting and whatnot. So that amount of energy and stimulus at the same time tends to work against me sometimes, and it makes me a bit antisocial. It makes me feel like, I don't want to be there long. I go in there with a game plan. I'm like, I'll be there for 45 minutes or an hour at most, and then I'm happy to, say my goodbyes and get home. And so, it has a varying interface when it comes to how it shows up for me. Like if I have, for example, traveling, I was flying for work last week and I feel like I just had knots in my stomach the night before because I don't travel very often for the same reason, right? So then, going into it, I think one thing that has helped me as it's shown up because of, activities related to work, I think being able to show up in a kind of not a passive way, but in a way where I'm doing it like if I was going to the grocery store, I almost fool my mind into it's not a big deal, and I don't think about it to that extent. Even though there might be follow up emails telling me that this meeting is happening or that this travel time is happening, I try to almost like pretend like I didn't see it, just so then that way by the time it starts to happen or I'm in motion, it's a lot easier for me to just kind of intake. It's a form of reframing for me because then, if I look at it like the meeting is important, but it's another meeting. And I also think about the abundance, right? Like having an abundance mindset to where there's going to be lots of meetings in the career that, this is part of what we do. So it makes it a lot more digestible and palatable for me at that time to think about, okay, well, there's going to be more. So this one doesn't stand out so much. This is just the one that I have in front of me right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, my dad says, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Love it.
So we both are big into mental health advocacy. Why is advocacy a passion of yours?
I would say mental health advocacy is a huge part of my life. I think because I feel the energy and I share in the energy with my brother who has since passed away. He passed away in 2021. And so, having seen him not only struggle, but also thrive through a lot of his challenges. I think that motivated me to want to just get the information out into the world, right? Because it's the same way that my family had no resources. I think that especially within Latino culture or Latina culture, we tend to look at things from two perspectives. One of them is, forcing our way through and surviving, and the other is maybe from a religious aspect, maybe some prayer, or maybe, it has to do with behavior. So, my mom famously wanted to help us through getting us closer to the church. And when I realized that this was far deeper than any one behavior, any one incident, I realized that not only did I need to be a mouthpiece for my brother, but also understand what he was going through to the degree of, helping him understand himself at times, because he would question, like, why am I going through these things, and kind of do a little bit of the self-blame. And I had to give him as much insight as I had at the moment. And so even if it was a small amount, it was definitely more than what he was going to receive outside of our relationship. So I constantly reinforced him that everything was figure outable, I guess is a terrible way to say it grammatically, but that's, just kind of the energy behind it, is that there's always a way. And I always found and fought for hope with him. And so I just want to be able to share that hope with the world at large.
I'm so sorry about the loss of your brother.
Thank
Are
you.
you willing to share what helped you grieve with the loss of your brother?
Absolutely. What helped me grieve the loss of my youngest brother, he was like a son to me. I had 13 years on him. So literally, I'd be in the mall, pushing around a stroller, and people thought he was my son. I'm like 17, and so he was extremely close to me as I was to him. And so some of the coping mechanisms have definitely been to understand that it wasn't anybody's fault. I think that that is huge because, the grief brings a lot of guilt, and it makes me specifically, it made me feel like there was something I could do more. There was a way, there was something that I could have, figured out, or there was someone else that we could have talked to, or some other medication that we could have found. But, this is a time sensitive situation where your diagnoses, from what I understand, don't quote me, but it's like, you spend 8+ years searching for a medication that might help and whatnot. And so I couldn't sit back, and the way that I saw it was I felt almost like a helper of his to go and find the best in life and the best ways to cope and deal with life. And so if I was doing that for him, I didn't want it to just stop because he wasn't here. I felt like now I have this pile of amazing tools and resources that I've come to know and understand. Now it's not only up to me to use them, but also on me to share them. So that's, helped me a lot through the grieving process.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, it must be really tough losing somebody you love so close to you. Going back to your culture, you mentioned you're Latino. Are there any mental health barriers or stigma within your culture and community?
Absolutely. Some of the cultural barriers within Latino culture with mental health and stigma is, for me, the biggest one is going to be the stigma itself. It's just not wanting to even have it. It's almost taboo to the point where if somebody is talking about it, then it's almost like a feeling like the family somehow is tainted. And so the sense is, let's not admit to anything. Maybe it's not what you think it is. Maybe it's just a phase. And there's a lot of ignoring to it, a definitive kind of ignorance to it, to where we just want to pretend like it's not there. And then if there is some kind of help or maybe a medication, prescribed, et cetera, then, oh, it just helps, but, it's not a big deal. And everything is just really swept under the rug. So for me, the biggest one is going to be the stigma.
For sure. I can relate to that. I don't know if it tied into my culture at all. To be honest, I grew up in a Jewish household, but one of my parents, well, both of my parents had mental health challenges, and they both very much swept it under the rug and refused to take medication and refused to get the help they needed, and were very much in denial. So that was my role model, was deny, do nothing about it, and now I'm the one who's doing quite a lot of work, and so have my sisters as well. But I think it's interesting. It's between different generations, the boomers and the millennials and the Gen Zs, I feel like as we're progressing, there's more and more awareness, less stigma, and hopefully by the next generation, there's no barriers in any culture, and then I think we're working our way towards that.
Absolutely.
So I know we're both big fans of music. You're a music exec. I'm an artist. You're a music producer. How has music been a positive influence on your well-being?
Music has been an extremely positive influence in my life in general. And I think a lot of it had to do with taking ownership kind of your own life. Because for me, the big turning point was realizing that in music, there's a kind of misconception from an outsider's perspective, which I came into it with no resources, no friends. There wasn't any, family, relative, or someone that came in and said, I work for such and such company and you can come and kind of learn the ropes. So for me, I always say it almost feels like I wasn't even supposed to kind of be here. And so it came from a place where I had to take full ownership of who I was and start to make it my own. And I think it became a metaphor for my entire life. I had to make my entire life my own. When we have, whether it's a career or a job that kind of stifles our inner being, our true selves, and we're not getting to that self actualization point, I feel like that plays a part in how we reflect on ourselves and we put that energy onto ourselves. So we carry a lot of extra weight because we are not able to express ourselves fully. And so for me, it's the self expression part. And now being on the business side, just kind of helping others see themselves through and really become whoever they see in their mind's eye, the passion, letting it burst through and letting them express themselves and giving them resources and tools to move themselves forward within a space that so famously it becomes almost like the gatekeeper, secrecy, like, oh, you're not going to know what I know because I had to work this hard to get to where I'm at. We're kind of breaking those barriers with having a platform that's basically open to all creators for them to use all the resources and tools that they possibly can to make their business their own. And that's what has become, right, their version of their music business. It's not the music business at large, it's your music business and what you do with it.
For sure. Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that. So I'm out of questions. Is there anything that like I didn't go over, anything you didn't go over that you'd like to touch on?
Absolutely. I think for me, anytime that we have a conversation in relation to any kind of mental health, be it breaking down stigma or just having the conversation, for me, I just want to express a lot of gratitude because I feel like as much as we can do in a day, there probably might never be enough because it's not going to get down into the cracks and crevices of every household and every conversation. But the more we do it, the better, not only do we get at it, but the more often it can be shared, the more resources are available. And for me, I felt so secluded when it came to wanting to find resources that just finding one or two good pieces of information felt like pokes of new light into a dark space that we were in at the time. So for me, it's just expressing a massive sense of gratitude to the platform, to you. Thank you, XRA, and the platform for helping us continue the conversation.